Hello, everyone, and welcome to the CommQuest Hope Discovered podcast. My name is Bill. Hope Discovered is a podcast series from CommQuest Services. This podcast features individuals in recovery from addiction and mental illness, recovery services professionals, and community advocates who offer insight on how we provide hope to the communities we serve. We often have guests share their personal journey of hope from their own experience. With us today is Kara Vogt. Kara is the co-founder of the Father's Motorcycle Poker Run, a 9-year member of the Stark County Opiate Task Force, a volunteer for CommQuest Services, and an advocate for family addiction, recovery, and a parent of a person in recovery. Kara, thank you so much for being on the podcast today.
Well, thank you for having me, Bill. It's always a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you very much. Likewise. Family members of people suffering from addiction can struggle with lives full of chaos, turmoil, and often experience a complicated mix of feelings, including guilt, grief, confusion, anger, frustration, and hopelessness. What we're going to talk about today is, in fact, the impact that addiction recovery has on the family members of people who are on that journey. And quite frankly, when it comes to a lot of medical conditions, we often forget about the caregivers, about the family members who have to support the individual who is going on that journey. So let's start there. How does having a family member struggling from addiction impact a person?
Well, you hit the nail on the head there with the emotional implications, the guilt, the grief, the anger, the frustration, etc. But what a lot of people don't realize is all of those things, that stress can have a huge physical impact on family members as well. You know, we're not sleeping, we have trouble functioning at work, or sometimes the opposite. In my case, I functioned great at work and I couldn't function at home because work was my escape from the chaos and turmoil that was going on in my house. And it can literally make you sick. It can make you physically sick, as well as making you, emotionally unstable and just, out of your mind with worry and grief and worry, especially always the worry for that worst case scenario cropping up, which is probably the biggest thing that keeps us in that enabling loop, is the fear of what's going to happen when we step outside of that. Yes. Not to mention, you're so blinded by all of these other emotions and things that are going on that you lose sight of the fact that you can step outside of the circle of chaos and you can find yourself again and you can find a way to get back to peace. Yes. There's a line in a song that I like that says, "You keep losing pieces in an effort to make things whole." And to me, that sums up, trying to hold a family together in addiction circumstances perfectly, because we keep losing pieces of ourselves as we try to control the other person, thinking that, it's all their problem. All they fix their problem and all our problems are going to go away. Well, that's the big slap in the face a lot of times that comes when they do get in to recovery, whether short-term or long-term, is that there are still going to be issues that have to be addressed. And there are still going to be things that need to be mended in that relationship, even though the initial disease may be in remission or, long-term sobriety.
I can certainly understand how it can get overwhelming. Like all the things you're talking about. For example, you're never really asleep.
Exactly.
You're never really relaxing with your friends. We go out to have dinner, you're checking the phone. And that can really just pick away at your well-being. And then there's all these things. Well, what about the future? How do you manage that? How do you corral that? And for anyone who's going through it, it doesn't get solved in one day, correct?
It does not get solved in one day, and you don't get there in one day. It's a process. as your loved one's addiction is also a process, as they go further down the rabbit hole, we go further down the rabbit hole right behind them because we don't know what else to do. You don't want to let them out of your sight because then you've got another level of worry. What's going to happen? Where are they? Are they okay? Is there something else I should be doing? And the answer, of course, is there's actually a lot less things you should be doing, but we can talk more about that.
Interesting. Will you talk a little bit about the 3 C's? That's something I've heard you talk about before in relation to finding freedom in family recovery. Do you want to cover that a little bit?
Okay. Yeah. The 3 C's, these come from Al-Anon, but basically it's you didn't cause it, you can't control it, and you can't cure it. And that's what you need to do is get all that stuff through your thick head. Mm-hmm. For me, it took a couple of years to get all that stuff through my thick head because my head's pretty thick. But it's, what I get a lot of times people coming into family support in the beginning is you feel like you don't have any choices. Mm-hmm. You're stuck in that loop of enabling because you feel like there's no other way. If I don't do these things, the worst case scenario is going to happen.
Yeah.
So what you have to kind of come to terms with first is there are always choices. You always have choices for yourself. You never have choices for the other person, assuming we are talking about an adult. Now, that's been my experience was with an adult person. When you're talking about someone underage, that's a different conversation and one I don't have personal experience to really comment on. But the part where the starting point for me, especially as a mom, was, oh my God, it's all my fault. I'm the mom. I must have done something horribly wrong for my child to turn out this way. Even though intellectually I know I did not tell him to go out and, do these risky behaviors. In fact, I gave him a lot of information about, doing things a different way.
Sure.
But because I'm the mom and I'm the parent, I want to take responsibility for that. And part of that equation is if there's something that I did that caused this, then surely there is something I can do to fix it.
Right.
So that's where we struggle. If I caused it, I can fix it. Well, no, you can't. Okay. So maybe I can't fix it. Maybe I learn after a while that everything I'm doing is not fixing it. But I still think maybe I can control it. Maybe if I just, I keep my eye on him and I keep him in my house where I know what's going on and I can be aware of things, then maybe I can find a different way to respond. I can find that piece that's going to put my puzzle back together and make my family whole again. And I have a lot of people I know that are, have been in support programs. We all struggle with control, especially when you get into the roller coaster of the up and down of, recovery, short-term recovery, then relapse, then maybe longer recovery, then relapse again. And my trajectory was pretty much in the beginning, I was still on the roller coaster. So as my loved one was in recovery, it was easier to stay in my recovery. And then as my loved one relapsed, then you could see that you have to be aware of your patterns of behavior again, or you fall right back into the negative patterns of behavior and enabling. But the longer you practice the things you learn in support programs, the easier it is to avoid those big highs and big lows. And, the latter half of my person's journey, I was off the roller coaster. My equilibrium did not go up and down with his anymore. And that is the real secret to surviving this thing is to get off the roller coaster and take care of yourself. And it seems terrible to say, oh, look, here's this person. I love them. They're struggling so much. So I'm just going to step back and do nothing. That feels wrong. But the bottom line is you can't control it. You cannot control the behavior of another adult person. You might be able to control it with a minor to some extent, but even then, anyone who's ever had a teenager can tell you you're not always in control.
No, you're not.
And you can't cure it. The other thing I kind of struggled with was, this is my child. I've known this person since before he was born. Surely I know him well enough to know what he needs and what's going to fix him. Well, you know what? I'm not a doctor. I'm not a mental health professional. I have never been in addiction myself. So no, I have no idea what is going to cure this. And because we tend to start out thinking it's behavior rather than a disease, you think you just need to moderate the behavior. If your family member has any other type of disease, you're going to get educated with them. If you love someone who has cancer, you're going to understand, the role that nutrition might play or, what their medical needs are, how is chemo going to affect them, that kind of thing. We tend not to do that in addiction. We tend to just say, oh, they just need to stop doing that and everything will be fine. And there's a whole lot more going on in the brain than that. And for me, that was the biggest thing for, you can't do any of these 3 C's really, but especially the cure was to understand that there really is a disease in the brain. There is something that fits the medical disease model. And getting educated about that was the biggest thing for me that turned the switch on my crazy behavior.
Yes.
And, just accepting that I have limitations.
Yes. I sometimes feel that parents, and I'm not an expert at all, but just from my experience with friends and family who have had children that have had any number of different issues, sometimes parents feel that children are extensions of themselves. But in fact, they're independent people. And, that's kind of how you have to, in my opinion anyway, you have to recognize that you're not plugged into them somehow.
Exactly. And adult people are going to make their own decisions. So you can't control another adult. People can change. I have changed tremendously on my own journey, through this situation, but people are not going to change for you. They change when they need change for themselves. And that's a hard thing for people on the sidelines of addiction to understand. We tend to think, well, they love drugs more than they love me. If they really loved me, they would stop doing this to me. Well, that when you learn about the science of addiction, what you realize is their brains are in a whole different place. They are operating in a survival mode that says drugs are the way to survive. And you can't fix that. You as a family member cannot fix the way someone else's brain is functioning. And it's important to understand that adult people have the right to make bad decisions. Even though we don't like their decisions, they still have the right to make those decisions. And you can't put your foot down on in my case, a 23-year-old and say, you're just not going to make any more bad decisions. Doesn't work. It doesn't work. And it's hard as a parent when your child reaches adulthood, you're supposed to see that they have learned the lessons that you taught them and they are setting themselves on a path toward responsible adulthood. Then it's easy to say, okay, I'm going to stop, being the parent now. But when you see your child as an adult and they're still making really bad choices, it makes it hard to say, okay, I still have to let you go and be an adult and make your adult choices, which are terrible.
Yeah, I think you've kind of touched on this. We wanted to ask you, what's the hardest concept for family members to accept? I think you've kind of laid it out, but correct me if I'm wrong. I'm kind of getting that. Well, it's not just as easy as get them clean and get them straightened out. It's not just that easy. When people give you that look, you mean to tell me blank. What is that usually in regard to?
Well, and the control is the big thing that people just, you don't want to let go of the wheel when you know the car is going to crash. And that's where we get into the biggest thing with control is you let go of that wheel. And yes, there is a good possibility that car is going to crash. It might be a mild collision. It could be, again, the worst case scenario. But you can't drive somebody else's car all the time. Right. At some point, we all have our own journey and we're all on our own road with that journey. And you certainly cannot drive two cars at once. I can't drive the car of my life on my journey and also still be in the car with you, driving your car in your lane on your journey. You can't do that. No one can do that, at least not effectively. And not without literally tearing yourself in half and burning yourself out and causing yourself a lot of problems.
We always talk about stigma a little bit on this podcast because it's such a big thing rolled into any type of substance use. And I've heard this conversation. Talking about a certain couple, they'll say, man, they have a great family, but that youngest kid, he's been nothing but a problem. And there's this attitude that this person is somehow a bad kid because of these types of problems. And here again, getting back to any other disease that you would talk about, we wouldn't refer to it in that way. And that's got to be tough for parents. It's got to put a strain on family where you do have, let's say, a number of siblings that don't have any issues. It's got to be a tough dynamic. Well,
and it's a good point that you make regarding stigma, because I think families can stigmatize themselves. I mean, I've just told you, I did stigmatize myself. I'm a terrible mother because my child ended up with the disease of addiction. I must have done something wrong. So I'm already judging myself. When I go out into the world, I'm going to pretty much be expecting that other people will judge me just as harshly as I have judged myself.
Yeah.
And that's hard. You know, I've talked about this on the podcast before, to take that first step and walk into that support meeting or log on to that virtual screen. And, you know, pretty much you feel like you're in there admitting defeat and admitting that you are a bad parent. Even if you didn't cause it, I'm still a bad parent because I can't figure out what I did, what I need to do to fix it. Because, of course, that's the other thing we don't want to admit as parents is we don't always know exactly what to do. We might fake it pretty good, but we don't always know. And I do think it's hard for people to come into a group of strangers and say, this is what's been going on in my family, even though you know that these people you're going to talk to have probably similar situations, and in your own head, you may be judging them as well.
Sure.
And you have to let go of the judgment. We have to let go of it all the way around. We have to stop judging our loved ones because of the things that they do in addiction. I don't want to exactly say through no fault of their own, but because of the crazy signals that their brain is sending them. And we have to stop judging ourselves for the things that we did or didn't do that were right or wrong, and not judge other people and say, you know, well, they must have done something wrong too, because they're in the same group as I am, and clearly I did everything wrong. So I do think that we can stigmatize ourselves, or we can be afraid of stigma from other people because of this thing that's in our family. And I think that does tend to hold people back from getting into support programs.
Yeah. Or accessing help in the first place.
Exactly.
We're going to talk about some important things to remember. And one of the things that you touched on is that addiction is a disease, that negative behaviors are the symptoms, not the causes. And let's start there. Can you maybe put that a different way or summarize it a little bit?
Well, you know, my very first night at CommQuest Family Support Group back in 2014, and I was just devastated. Because we had found out that our loved one was stealing from us. And although intellectually I knew that this is one of the behaviors that is common with addiction, you know, I thought, well, you know, my son loves me. He's not gonna be like those other people and steal from me. And so I'm talking about this in my first opportunity to vent. And our facilitator says, okay, everybody who's been stolen from in this room, raise your hand. Well, it was everybody in the room.
Yeah.
So that was my, you know, and the more you attend and you hear people's stories, sure, the details are different. The substance may be different, but our stories are so much the same. Mm-hmm. And you start to see that there are symptoms. You know, if somebody tells you they have a cough and a runny nose, you're going to be, oh, you might have a cold. Mm-hmm. Well, if you tell me you have someone in your house who's acting erratically and stealing from you and lying to you all the time and hiding things from you, then I'm going to think, oh, you might have someone struggling from addiction, because these are the common things that we see. Mm-hmm. Manipulation being another one of the big negative behaviors that we see. And so you start to realize, yeah, there are common threads within all of our stories. And those to me are the symptoms of the disease. And of course, if you can access, and there are some really good things online that explain how addiction affects the brain. And some of them even go through what a disease model is in medicine. Like, so what are the parameters that something has to have to call it a disease? And, you know, you find information on how addiction fits into that model. It's a real eye opener. Oh. But there are some resources, which we're going to talk a little bit about resources before we're done. So we'll Absolutely. Come back to that.
Yes. And we've kind of touched on this as well, but that addiction is a family disease. It affects everyone around them. Certainly the parents and the siblings, sometimes depending on their ages. I'm sure that throws off the dynamic of parents spending, giving attention to all the children. It all goes to one. So it can be very complicated, correct?
Yes, it can be very complicated. And that's one of the few saving graces in my situation is, we were dealing with an only child, but I could not imagine trying to navigate that with one child and still have to have that energy.
Right. To take
care of the rest of the family. It was hard enough just to take care of myself.
Yes.
In all of that. Where there are siblings or other family members, those relationships are damaged. You can find that the non-addicted siblings have resentment toward the parents because the squeaky wheel sibling got all the attention. You're not in agreement necessarily with your family members on what you should be doing. In my case, my husband and I were always at odds, because he was much more willing to step back, and I just wanted to run in there and enable, for everything I was worth. And I did. Don't get me wrong. I did for quite some time. But that, again, is where family support can help. And even at this point, we're not necessarily always on the same page, my husband and I. But we have learned through the tools in family support that we don't have to be on the same page. I can't control his reaction to our family member's addiction any more than he can control my reaction to the addiction, any more than we can control the addiction behaviors in our loved one.
Sure.
And that's a problem we see a lot of times with family group, is you have one parent, a lot of times, especially with divorced couples, where one is still enabling a lot and the other one has gotten some help and has stepped back from that. Yeah. So yeah, all the relationships become chaotic.
Right. The other thing we want to mention is that addiction is a chronic disease. And in simple terms, I mean, it's the idea that all we have to do is get this person cleaned up, as it were. That's the phrase we use, and everything will be fine. Family education can have a positive impact on the addicted person's success. It is the most important contribution you can make to this lifelong process. And here again, recovery is possible. But the idea that recovery is something that happens on a particular day is probably not the case.
Exactly.
Yes.
Exactly. Yeah. In some ways, recovery can be more difficult to navigate for a family member because the rules change. Okay, I can get it through my thick head eventually after 2 or 3 years that, everything I do to help my loved one in addiction is actually enabling his addiction. But then when recovery happens, now what I want to do is I want to throw all that stuff I learned away and I want to just go back to the way everything was. Well, the way everything was maybe not ideal and is probably not what you need to be doing for the future. The answers to the future are not in the past. And there are still boundaries that need to be in place. There were still a lot of things I did initially in recovery that I thought I was being supportive, but I was still being controlling. In my head, if I, get your 12-step meeting schedule and I remind you every day, that you should be going to a meeting and I offer to give you a ride to a meeting and I ask you how your meeting was when you got home and did you get a sponsor yet and blah, blah, blah. You know what? I'm not supporting you. I'm nagging you and I'm trying to control your recovery to make sure that it continues to be a recovery. Yeah. So boundaries are great for all situations in families. Absolutely. And that's the biggest thing that we have to learn as family members is what are healthy boundaries. And it's the simple fact is healthy boundaries for an addiction situation are healthy boundaries for almost all situations. Most certainly.
You have talked about resources, and I know that you're very much an advocate for family support. Do you want to talk about that?
Yes, there are a lot of ways that you can access family support. First of all, if you're not in family support, you need to go there now. I'm trying to control you. You need to go there now. Nothing is going to get better until you go. But there are, like I say, there are multiple options. CommQuest has a wonderful family support group, as you know, I've been a part of for 10 years. Al-Anon has numerous meetings. They have their schedules posted online. There are Alateen meetings, which are for youth 10 to 20 years old. There are some other organizations that have strictly online programming in this area. The great thing about the virtual meetings is if you can access them, it opens up your options tremendously. So there is a 12-step program called Smart Recovery that has a family support. There is a family support program called Families Anonymous. We don't have physical meetings for those in this area, but you can join a virtual meeting. And Al-Anon has virtual meetings, and I'm delighted now to say that CommQuest does have a virtual option for our family support group, which CommQuest Family Support Group meets on Tuesdays from 5:30 to 7.
That is correct. And as some of our listeners may know, we have restructured some of our locations. Now, the family support group meets Tuesdays from 5:30 until 7 p.m. This is at the Canton Outpatient Campus, Building A at 601 Cleveland Avenue Northwest in Canton. Now, this building is what we normally call the Metro Building, so if you're familiar with that, that's where it is. Participants should use the main entrance and take the elevators to the second floor. Just approach the main desk and someone will direct you to the meeting room. There is also a virtual option using a Microsoft Teams. Simply email familysupport@comquest.org. Once again, send an email to familysupport@comquest.org and request a link for the meeting. Again, this will happen on Microsoft Teams. This and more information will be included in our show notes. We would also like to add that family support is an all-encompassing term that refers to anyone who is a direct support person for someone in recovery. Partners, best friends, siblings, foster families, and so on, all are welcome.
Yeah, and I do want to mention the Father's Motorcycle Poker Run did fund a resource access website, which is Stark, like Stark County, heroinepidemic.org. That website has been up since 2016 and will be up through July of 2025. And a lot of these other family support options that I mentioned can be accessed through that website. There are links for Families Anonymous, Smart Recovery, Al-Anon, all of the things that I mentioned. There are also there's a links page on that site as well that can direct you to some of the educational materials that I was discussing as far as getting information about the disease of addiction and how that affects the brain. So you can get to a lot of resources that way.
That is fantastic. We always wrap up. The podcast is called Hope Discovered. One of the taglines that we often use here at CommQuest is Hope Happens Here. So with that theme of hope, what would be your message of hope for family members of people who are suffering through addiction and on that recovery journey?
Well, absolutely. Recovery is possible. But you need a recovery too. If you are a family member, you need a recovery of your own. You need to recover yourself because I guarantee you have lost some of it. But it is possible to have and maintain a loving relationship with someone who is in an active addiction. You don't have, and I took me a long time to figure out how to do that. For a long time, I was up and down. When we were in an active phase, we stepped back. We didn't have a relationship. And then we would go into the recovery phase and, we'd get together and be all warm and fuzzy again. But I got tired of that. I got tired of waiting to have a relationship with my son. I got tired of missing him. Mm-hmm. Even though the person, he was not complete in his personhood, I still missed him. Mm-hmm. And what I learned in family support was how to do what is best for the relationship, especially when you're talking about adult family members. Mm-hmm. My relationship at this point is not to parent you. It's to have an adult parent relationship with you. And that is possible, but it requires a different set of tools from the ones that you thought you were going to use when your child reached adulthood. And that's what we can teach you. We can teach you how to put the relationship first. And not every situation will be able to have a healthy relationship in that circumstance. It doesn't always happen, but without tools, it's not going to happen at all. In my family, we made it happen, but it meant letting go of a lot of things. Mm-hmm.
Your dedication is so profound. Your dedication is so obvious. Your passion for this topic and all that you've done with the volunteer work, your involvement with us here at CommQuest, your history with the Father's Motorcycle Poker Run. Boy, we just can't thank you enough for all of that you have done for the recovery community. I mean, it's absolutely incredible. Thank you so much.
Oh, well, thank you. It's been a pleasure to do it.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Kara. Again, your presence and your wisdom is so much appreciated. You've been listening to the Hope Discovered podcast, and we will talk to you again very, very soon.